I
All right, everyone. Just gonna wait for people to slowly come in. Gonna have a big crowd tonight. And we're about quarter way there, so we're just gonna wait for people to come in. As you're coming in, let us know where you're tuning in from. Um, I looked at the list earlier today, and I saw that there were people from all over the country, which is really cool. We usually have a very Connecticut centric or New England centric audience, and I saw people from all over, even people from the UK. So let us know where you're coming in from. Let us know what brought you here today, or tonight. Do you know Jared? Do you know Christoph? Are you interested in the topic? And pretty soon I will start with my introduction.
Shout out to Santa Cruz from a former Cal State U kid. Austin, okay.
Austin and Asheville, West Cornwall.
I'm holding out for Indiana here. I'm not seeing it. I'm not expecting it, but we're hoping is what's happening.
Hey,
Okay,
we're more than
Kentucky.
halfway there. So I'm just going to go ahead and get started. For those of you who don't know me, hi, I'm Omar Acevedo. I'm the literary program coordinator at the Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford, Connecticut. And I'm delighted to host tonight's program, The Midnight Kingdom, A History of Power, Paranoia, and the Coming Crisis. So our virtual programs are produced in part with support honoring the late Frank Lord. We are happy to honor his memory with these programs. And we are incredibly grateful to the Wish You Well Foundation and Connecticut Public WNPR for supporting all of our virtual programs. Now let me tell you more about tonight's program. We are welcoming Jared Yates Sexton and Christoph Mergerson for a discussion of Jared's book, The Midnight Kingdom, which is an ambitious account of how white supremacist lies, religious mythologies, and poisonous conspiracy theories built the modern world and threatened to plunge us into an authoritarian, I always have trouble with this, authoritarian nightmare. So our author, Jared Yates Sexton, is the author of American Rule, The Man They Wanted Me to Be, and the People Are Going to Rise Like the Waters Upon Your Shore. His political writing has appeared in publications including the New York Times, the New Republic, Political, and Salon.com. Sexton is also the host of the Muckrake podcast and the author of 3 collections of fiction. Our moderator, Christoph Mergerson, is an assistant professor in the Philip Merrill College of Journalism at the University of Maryland. Prior to Maryland, he was a research assistant for telecommunications policy with the Brookings Institution in Washington and a Night News Innovation Fellow with the Tao Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia University. Now, we encourage you to have a conversation in the chat. If you have a specific question, please post it directly into the Q&A section. If you post it in the chat, it might get lost in there, and we really want to get your questions. You can also click on live transcript to see live auto captioning of this event. And I will be putting a link in the chat to purchase The Midnight Kingdom through our museum store, and I'll put it in a few times so it won't get lost in there. And yeah, that's all from me. So I will hope you enjoyed this, and I will turn this over to Jared and Christoph.
All right. Thank you very much, Omar. Thanks for hosting. Thanks for having us. Jared in Indiana, how are you doing today?
I'm hanging in there. How are you? I'm so excited for this talk. I've been looking forward to it, biting on the old fingernails, just getting pumped. Thank you for doing it.
Well, it's going to be great, and let's just jump right into it. So, what a pleasure to read your book. Really enjoyed it. Let's start by discussing your background a little as it relates to this book. So, in the introduction, you relate your experiences growing up in a very religious community in Indiana, which I can relate to as somebody who grew up and has lived in various parts of the South. And you draw a connection between these experiences, particularly in church and observing your very conservative grandmother and how she understood the world. So you draw a connection between that and the themes in your book. And I wonder if audience how your upbringing inspired you to write this book.
Yeah, and thank you for that. It's a weird thing to talk about where I came from. I come from a small town in Indiana, in an evangelical background. My family was extremely poor, factory workers, laborers, limestone miners, the type. And the evangelical community gave our family its stories, how the world worked, what it did, what was happening day to day. And I love my family. I love my community members very, very much. They weren't necessarily informed, right? They would watch like the nightly news, or they would read the newspaper, all of that. But what was often missing in terms of like what was being reported, what was being talked about, was why things happened, right? And like you and I can pick up a paper or a magazine, and we understand some of the forces that are taking place. We understand the economics, we understand the societal, the political forces, those types of things. Maybe even we have specialties, right, that we've spent a lot of time researching, and so we have that. My family filled it in with religious mythology and religious narratives. And by the way, this isn't an anti-religious book, right? What this is about is how religious ideas and stories can be weaponized. And unfortunately, that's what happened to my family. The evangelicalism that I grew up in was very, very extreme. It was filled with conspiracy theories that if you and I were to talk about them at length, would sound very familiar now. It's the idea that the world is it's corrupted, it's decayed, it's evil. There are malevolent people who are behind the scenes, and they're pulling the strings, and they're trying to get after us. They're trying to corrupt the world. They're trying to destroy America. Our politicians are oftentimes corrupted by them. Our movies, our television shows, our music, all of it is a means of trying to corrupt us. And for anybody at home who says, that sounds a lot like anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, you are 100% correct. That is what it is. It is a laundered evangelical view of that. My family didn't understand that, and didn't understand that they were being prepared for anti-democratic behaviors. Whenever we talk about things like the New World Order or the deep state, or now we talk about QAnon or the big lie, what we're actually doing is we're telling people that they cannot trust democracy, that they cannot trust other people, and that they are in a world where their only option, and evangelicalism makes this very obvious, their only option is to fight war. It's to carry out violence or spiritual violence or some sort of an oppression of others. And so my family, in getting sold this over and over again, was being prepared more or less for what we see now. People are very surprised by Christian nationalism, Trumpism, all of this stuff. It was simply the movement from communities like mine into the larger culture. It escaped those small communities and those areas and those churches, and now it has become a political force that unfortunately we have to reckon with.
And what would happen if somebody within the community, I'm not talking about some, fancy pants professor or some person who can't really relate to that community, but let's say somebody in that community were to come to your grandmother, to come to others in the community who have these beliefs and say, I don't really think you're thinking about this the right way, or there's something wrong in the way you're thinking about these events. What would the reaction tend to be? And why do you think those reactions were the way they were when people are challenged on these things?
Unfortunately, I don't think they'd get in the house. There'd be a shotgun involved, Christoph. But I got to tell you that honestly, I think a lot of what happened here, and I want to go ahead and give a little bit of a basic background.
Sure.
Something that has happened, and for anybody who's watching who wants to understand more of how we've arrived at this moment, I cannot recommend enough that people go and read a document called the Powell Memo. And the Powell Memo in the early 1970s was drafted basically trying to get the wealthy of this country, particularly the conservative wealthy of this country, to invest their money, to invest their wealth and their energies and their powers in creating a capitalist-friendly structure. This was after, of course, the 1960s, 1970s societal revolutions, including civil rights, feminist revolutions, free speech revolution. And the idea was that facts were not on the side of the wealthy, right? Like, and this went in the tradition of, tobacco companies understanding that they were causing cancer, but putting out misinformation, fossil fuel companies understanding in the 1950s that they were causing climate change and putting out misinformation. The Powell memo went to create new experts, new apparatuses, also to go into academia and take over those places and, sort of crack consensus.
Sure.
Now, that's all downstream from my family. And that I don't think that they would have ever understood that they had been told over and over again by Republicans, by evangelicals, by Ronald Reagan, you name it, they could not trust experts. They just couldn't do it, right? Because experts were a different group of people. They were out to take their money, they were satanic, any number of things. They were part of the problem, right? My family was the type that if, let's say, there was a headline about the AIDS crisis in the late 1980s, that was obviously a symptom of evil, right? It was obviously a
Right.
genetic experiment carried out by scientists. And the entire idea and purpose was that they were insulated from the information that they needed. But I would also point out some of what's happening now. My family and people like them, they can't afford to go to college.
Okay.
College has been made so exorbitantly expensive that for me to even go to college, I had to take on just tens of thousands of dollars of debt. I'm incredibly lucky. And by the way, I'm so privileged to be talking with you and I'm so excited. But for me to talk to you here, I had to go through so much debt wise that other people, they make decisions not to. And there is, of course, now a class, but also geographic divide that takes away experts, that takes away specialists, that puts them over here, and it puts other people over here. And there's a natural antagonism. And so as a result, if somebody would have tried or now would try, I mean, they barely let me in the front door half the time. If someone were to try and go and talk to them as of right now, they would be seen as opposition. They would be seen as agents of evil. They would be seen as corruptive. And
The
so as
people
a
we've been
result,
warning about. No, I was just saying, I'm sorry, I was just saying the people that you were warned about, those people.
yeah, no, I mean, listen, there was hardly a Sunday where we didn't talk about atheist scientists or, the evil academics who are trying to corrupt and indoctrinate the children, which, if that sounds familiar, it should, right? I mean, it
Right.
was about trying to keep the communities separate and information from moving back and forth.
Let me ask you this. Let's talk about the book's title because I think that's very notable. The Midnight Kingdom and what inspired it. So there's a tie between this title and a man named Alexander Dugin, who has also been called Vladimir Putin's brain. And yes, for those of you who are wondering, this is the Alexander Dugin who has been a strong advocate of the war in Ukraine and whose daughter, Daria Dugina, was killed in a car bombing outside of Moscow last August. So please explain this title and its tie to Dugin and why you chose this title for your book.
Yeah, so Alexander Dugin is this neo-fascistic ideologue who has a theory. And by the way, it's shared with several people. It's shared, of course, with Steve Bannon, but it's also shared with elements of the new right, such as national conservatives. It is the idea that our modern era, particularly neoliberalism, which I'm sure we'll talk about at some point and get some definitions down, this modern way that the world works, we all feel that it's groaning, that it's starting to not function correctly, that maybe some things need to change. Dugin and others like him, these neo-fascistic, neo-feudalistic sort of personalities and ideologues, they believe that we are nearing midnight, which there's an entire huge philosophy behind it that involves Martin Heidegger. We could talk about Heidegger for a while, but that's neither here nor there. But it's the idea that we are coming to the end of a cycle, that we are about to watch the modern world break and shuffle, which is one of the reasons the Ukrainian war is taking place, right? But I go ahead and I argue, I don't think that they're wrong. I think that they're actually correct in their criticism that our modern world is about to go through a change. I just happen to think, Christoph, that they are absolutely wrong about why it's happening, and they're absolutely wrong about what should be done about it. I happen to think that they are incredibly dangerous people, and I felt that Dugin's commentary on this and his philosophy of it, I thought was a pretty good launching off point in terms of like how to explain how we've arrived here and what that means.
Awesome. So there are dominant themes in your book along the lines of how, in my estimation, and correct me if I'm wrong, but how, and you touched on this a little bit, but how apocalyptic interpretations of Christianity, paired with xenophobia and white supremacy, and paired with conspiracy theories have been used by authoritarian rulers and movements, really going back to antiquity. And I'd like to talk about some of that history just a little bit, because I want our viewers to understand that you really go into rich detail to trace these elements throughout history and talk about how they have affected societies. That, that discussion in turn informs kind of what we're seeing today in various parts of the world, be it here in the United States or in Hungary or in Brazil, or in other parts of the world that are dealing with these authoritarian movements. So let's take a trip back to antiquity for a moment here. So you talk about the imperial cults and how it was essentially the dominant religion in Roman society. Rome allows a certain amount of religious diversity so long as you pay appropriate fealty to the emperor. But long story short, Rome declines and is replaced eventually by Christianity as the dominant official religion. And this Christianity does not tolerate diversity the same way the imperial cult does. How and why does this transition happen, and what are the ramifications of this for early European society?
Yeah, so tell me at home, obviously you can't. If this sounds halfway familiar, right? You have a historically powerful empire. And there's a story behind it that it's exceptional. There's never been anything like it. You can call it Rome, you can call it America, whatever you want to call it. And all of a sudden, like this religious belief that this thing is exceptional, it's been chosen by God, it's been chosen by the universe, it's been chosen by history, that all of a sudden this thing starts stacking up L's, right? All of a sudden this thing just isn't. Maybe you lose a war, I don't know, maybe you have a forever war of 20 years and all of a sudden the stock market crashes and all of a sudden people are living shorter lives, I don't know. As these things happen, that idea that you are chosen by God or the universe or history, it's not sustainable. It doesn't work because something has gone wrong. And the amazing thing about this is whenever this happens, these conspiracy theories, the ones that we're talking about, the New World Order, the deep state, QAnonism, big lie, any of these, what it does is really, really powerful. It gives an explanation. It says the reason why we're in decline, it's nothing that we've done. It's nothing that's wrong with the country or the order or the powerful, right? We're under attack by evil forces. And the evil forces are outside of here, they're barbarians, but also there are traitors among us, Christoph. We got to find them, right? And by the way, it's weird how like it takes the onus off of the powerful and it puts them on their political enemies, right? It always happens that
It's
way.
very convenient that way.
It's very convenient how that happens. It's not the wealthy white dudes. It's, people of color. It's trans people. It's gay people. It's poor people, right? They're the ones who are like the problem. What happens is that Christianity becomes sort of the main operating mythology at this time. And it starts to tell these incredible stories. Apocalypticism, one of the most powerful weapons in human history. It basically says we have to do everything in our power to stave off the apocalypse. And by the way, there's an evil, malevolent force. Satan is out here doing all of this, right? And if you don't crush these enemies who have betrayed us and are trying to ruin us, well, guess what? It's not only going to be like you and your family who are going to die, the entire world is going to be destroyed. You're going to spend the rest of your life in torment and torture. And unfortunately, that's a really strong appeal, right? And if you're weighing the end of the world and the end of human civilization and malevolent evil winning forever, people's voting rights don't really weigh the same, right? People's ability to go about their lives and do what they want doesn't weigh the same. It creates a prime situation for oppression because you're oppressing people for their own good and everybody else's own good. And as a result, this continues to cycle through human history. There are moments before even Rome, you even see this kind of thing. But in Rome, that Christian mythology comes in and it makes like almost a perfect replacement engine for this imperial cult, and everything starts building around it, even past the Roman Empire itself and to today.
That's very interesting. And I think I can't remember if it was Adam Serwer or who was it who, I mean, I'm sure it's been used even before he used it, whoever was the first to use it, this idea of the cruelty is the point. With apocalypticism, it seems like that's literally, you are compelled to wipe out the enemies of God, however you're directed by the leaders that are pushing you to do this.
Well, and it's one of those things. I don't know how you felt about it, but like whenever Donald Trump started to be raised up as sort of like a divine agent or a messiah, a lot of people started saying, "Well, that's not the religion I know," and I looked around, I was like, "I know a lot about that," like that's not foreign. And part of
Yeah.
this idea, like, even goes back to this persecution complex that's within Christianity. People all the time are like, "Can you believe that ISIS was marauding around, destroying art and information and cultures?" Well, if you go back to when Christianity took over state power in Rome, it was persecution on a historic level. One of the reasons that we don't have much information about the ancient world is they destroyed it.
Yeah.
And as they're destroying it, they're murdering people, they're killing people, they're destroying all of these, what they see as apostates or what they see as heretics. And that entire pursuit, it picks up a gleeful momentum, right? Because it's a purifying fire. You are fighting on the right side of a war, and it gives these individuals, even now, because I have to tell you, part of the problem is there are a lot of Americans and a lot of people around the world who are looking for meaning. They're looking for something that to be a part of. And this thing, I mean, there's a reason why people are radicalized into terrorist sects, that people are
Absolutely.
radicalized into radical fundamentalist religious sects and movements. And what you see here is that it aligns perfectly with our conditions in the same way that it aligned perfectly in those Roman conditions.
And stop me if you've heard this one before. This sounds familiar, but when we talked about this a little bit before we started the program here, but you do write about this in your book, and I find it extremely interesting about how early Christians, of course, in Rome were the out group who were just horrifically persecuted in the most nightmarish ways you can imagine. And, things were said about them, such as they sacrifice children, and they like to drink the blood. And, right around the time, I guess the 4th century, 80 or so, when they essentially become the dominant in group,
Yep.
they started violently persecuting others, and they associated this thing we come to know as the blood libel with the Jewish communities. Can you expand a little bit? I know we've touched on it, but can you expand a little bit more about why anti-Semitism was so attractive to early Christians with this apocalyptic interpretation, and why you think, kind of based on the history you touch on in the book, that anti-Semitism has been so persistent?
Well, first of all, power is a hell of a drug. I mean,
It
really,
is.
it's, when you actually, I have to tell you, when I was doing the research on this book, when I found the blood libel against Christians in the catacombs, that I'm sure you've had this too. There's like one of those moments where like I had to check it multiple
To
times.
make sure you saw it correctly, what you were reading.
Right? And
Yeah.
then, like, I put it down and I had to go for, like, a walk, and I was like I came back and I was like, "I found QAnon in ancient Rome," right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
the entire idea was that the Christians, who, by the way, were so obnoxious to Roman society because everybody was just hanging out. Their gods were friendly, there was no real competition among them.
ISIS wants you to chill, no problems.
The cult of ISIS was about chilling out and appreciating nature.
Yeah.
And these Christians are coming around. Everyone's like, just stop. You got to quit. And they start worshiping, of course, in the catacombs. And it's always the question of what are those people doing over there that we don't know about? And then the stories begin that they're sacrificing children, they're drinking their blood, they're gaining superpowers, they're pedophile cults, all of these things, which are QAnon, by the way. So what happens is something that again is very traceable, which with everything from the history of whiteness to the history of wealth, right? Which is that these
Mhm.
things are malleable. And when you become the in group, you have an out group. And when you become part of the in group, you find the out group.
Game on. Yeah.
So the Jews obviously are their own issue. They were being persecuted by the Roman Empire. But then as Christendom started to take over the power of so-called Western civilization, they had to find some answers for some of their doctrine. The Jewish community became an incredible workaround to making Christian economies work, right? Because there were rules about not lending money and not
Right.
charging interest. So the Jews obviously get used in that regard. And as a result, they become an incredible scapegoat in that regard. So they're off away from the people. They're small in number, and on top of that, because of this process, they're considered, sort of persona non grata. Eventually, what happens, and it's funny, we talk all the time about like what the Crusades are, and in our minds we imagine like armies fighting over Jerusalem. It's so much different from that. It was a venting of internal frictions, right? Christendom was fighting each other to the death. There were civil wars everywhere, and they said, "Go over here, go over there, and take
Deal
things.
with them. Take that energy over there.
Just go over there, right? And take what they have." And on the way, they're like, "Maybe we should go after the Jews a little bit." So they go and they take everything from the Jews, and they murder the Jews, and they keep going after them. The persecution complex that powered Christianity in its beginning, when put in power, it becomes a mindset that everybody is out to get you. You know, even now we're living in this time, and it really is a self-inflicted wound. You read these articles, they're like, church attendance is going down, and they're like, oh, it's obviously the secular world. And it's like, no, you are pushing people away with extremist persecutorial ideas. And we keep seeing that over and over because they truly believe that everyone is out to get them, and that unless they control everything, which by the way is feudalism, that's exactly how that worked.
Yeah.
Unless they control, and by the way, even when they controlled everything, they couldn't stop fighting amongst each other, right? It was one after another, like winnowing down with inquisitions.
Find the
But
most pure.
exactly. But what always happens is that they end up finding, and the powerful using these mythologies, they find the Jews, of course. Now there's a reason why they're going after poor people, people of color. They're going after women, but especially why now it's moved towards, you know, even more marginalized groups where we're talking about gay and trans people. It's the easiest scapegoat, much like the Jews were on the edge of like the feudal community. You're going after the people that you can take the responsibility off of yourself and put it onto them.
Transfer.
Yeah.
Let's advance in our understanding of history and the themes you're talking about. You kind of touched on capitalism. So let's go to the age of exploration, aka the age of colonialism, and the development of capitalism. Talk a little bit about how interpretations of Christianity with this enforcement of a social hierarchy with God's chosen at the top and everybody else at the bottom. Talk about how that overlaps nicely with the era of colonialism and capitalism, and the development of capitalism in Western Europe in the early United States.
Isn't it weird how those notions of power always end up like being right there when you go out and take over, you know, an entire community or civilization? It's strange.
It's like a book you take off the shelf. This is useful. Take that one.
It's so funny, you know, because you take a look at how colonization was carried out, and it always followed a really predictable path. The church would say, we grant you this land, which by the way, it just so happens that like advanced civilizations are living on, you know, but it's weird too, because it's always people with different skin colors, different customs, and also they're always utilitarian societies that aren't interested in going out and like ruining everybody. So the church points to it and says, hey, that's yours, Christendom, you know, empire. And by the way, you're doing it to save their souls. You need to go introduce them to Jesus. So they send the soldiers, and behind them is a cross. And they're like, we're going to go and we're going to figure these people out. And what I found out, and like, I got to tell you, like, I grew up in this small Indiana town. The education that I always had, colonization was always happy business, Christoph.
Oh,
They were always welcoming the white folks in and like showing them what was going on, and they all got along and they had dinner.
Yeah.
And what happens is this really awful administrative task. You show up into this country with your religious things, and you say you have a choice, which is you enter into this religion where I am hierarchical above you, where you are below me, you will serve me. And if you don't do that, you die, or you're going to be tortured, or you're going to be, inquisitioned, right?
Yeah. Real bad things are about to happen. Yeah.
Real bad things are about to happen. And then even if they enter into that worldview immediately, they then systematically have their cultures destroyed. And the only thing that they're taught is a weaponized Christianity. And the weaponized Christianity says there's God, there's the Pope, there's white people, there's you. And you have to operate within that. And
are we talking about 1600s Mexico or 2023 Florida?
I know.
I lost track. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I
anyway,
know.
Please continue.
It's weird, Christoph. It's almost like this stuff repeats itself, you know? And it just kept happening throughout history where you go in, you do that, you destroy the society, and then it turns out once you save their souls, they either die because you've introduced some sort of disease to them, or they become an enslaved population. And they become part, and this is the weird thing we now live in this global world order, right? Where, you know, global capitalism is the norm, which, by the way, it happens. I don't know how to say this, but it doesn't happen at the point of the sword anymore. It happens with economic sanctions, which are, you know, don't have as much blood on them, right? So you either operate as a quote unquote second or third world country within this operating system, or you're crushed and your people are starved. Back then, of course, it was the dragoon, you know, or the Spanish Armada showed up or whatever.
Yep. Yep.
And you are put in an order that looks, and by the way, corporations are the ones carrying this out, weirdly enough. You are put in basically a worldwide production caste system. And it's the exact same thing. It just so happens that now there's a whole lot less, you know, going out and having to butcher the people with your own hands.
Yeah. And then you have the gall afterwards to refer to these countries by some profane expletive, as if, you know, your country, your government wasn't somehow responsible for putting them in the positions that they're in. So we look down on Haiti, we look down on African nations, we look down on South American and Central American nations.
I'm so glad that you brought up Haiti, because I think this is one of the least understood parts of what we would call modern history. For
Yeah.
those who are watching and maybe haven't read the book, please do. Like, the Haitian Revolution is when you start actually, like, I knew of it, you know, I had
Yeah.
sort of read a little bit about it, and then I did my research and it blew my mind. The Haitians, like a complete slave revolt, they fight off every major empire in the world.
It's like the colonial version of the Royal Rumble. They take on everybody, and they just, if you're
Stone
for wrestling
Cold's
fans,
coming in, Hulk
yeah,
Hogan's coming
yeah,
in, Andre the
yeah,
Giant is risen from the dead, he's coming in.
they took them all out.
They take them all out. Napoleon shows up and they beat Napoleon. And what happens is that the white supremacist idea, and by the way, all of those major empires, all the major countries, including the United States of America, are like, oh my God, we cannot possibly allow a slave uprising to work, which is why we gave money. Also, by the way, for those who don't know, the Haitian Revolution is one of the reasons eventually we have the Civil War. But as all of this is taking place, the Haitians proved themselves to not only be the equal of anybody, maybe even the better of anybody militarily. They put together a government that, like, how did they do it? Like, it wasn't like they were necessarily educated to do it. They just sort of came up with this idea. But what happens? The entire world heaps upon them crippling amounts of debt. And now we look at them and we just shake our heads. We're like, oh, some people just can't handle it. You know,
They'll
they
never
just
get their act together. What's wrong with them? Why? Yeah. Yeah.
It's incredible. The Haitian Revolution, and of course that's why it's not taught, is because it's like one of the most, like, you know, amazing things that's ever happened, but it should be taught everywhere.
Yeah. So you talked about a paranoid mindset earlier, and you write one of the most interesting, among the many interesting things you write in your book, is this line that American history is largely a story of paranoia, in the context of Americans constantly being afraid of these threats from the people they really, you know, wish to subjugate. Really, you know, in my opinion, in my interpretation, being afraid of other people doing to them that which they did to others. You know, they're afraid of that type of statement. So in the 18th and 19th century in the United States, there are some really weird conspiracy theories. Talk a little bit about those and about the effects of those on society.
I gotta say, by the way, on that note, I find so interesting. There was an HBO series, man, what is time? I want to say it was 2 years ago. It was Destroy All the Brutes or Kill All the Brutes. For anybody who's interested, excellent. And one of the things that they talk about a lot, and there's obviously been, this is a more accessible version of it, but it talks so much about the paranoia of white supremacy. The idea that, like, look at what you've done to all of these people, and if they ever get a chance, they're going to repay the favor, right? Which is the paranoia of white supremacy in a nutshell. It's tremendous. And so in all of this, in America, like from the very beginning, the folks who show up to colonize America in the first place are extremely religiously paranoid in the first place. You know, they think Satan is in the woods, and on top of that, Native Americans are wicked and awful coming to get them. Meanwhile, you know, we bring in slavery, and why wouldn't you be paranoid when you're outnumbered by people left and right and you are brutalizing them?
Yeah,
Eventually, Even the founding of the country, which is something that shocked me, is that it was based on the conspiracy theory that Britain was going to, the power from the outside was going to
Right.
come in with the traders on the inside, the enslaved population, the native people,
Native
and then
people,
they
yeah.
were going to come in and destroy the revolutionary cause.
Yeah.
Eventually we get in, and this was my personal favorite of this era, was getting to the election of 1800 and figuring out that the Federalists were calling Thomas Jefferson an Illuminati Antichrist agent, which is wild. And that they, all the people trying to break the stranglehold of the Federalists, they were all obviously Illuminati plants trying to destroy the country, call it QAnon 19th century special. Eventually we move forward, Freemasons, Illuminati, the very nature. The Catholics. I forgot about the Catholics.
Don't forget the Catholics. Yeah.
Yeah, because another fun thing is that they overthrew the colony of Maryland based on an anti-pope conspiracy theory, but we don't talk about that. So in the midst of all of this, every time throughout history, you keep finding these white supremacist conspiracy theories that protect the powerful. And by the way, we're bringing in, immigrants left and right to do a bunch of barely paid labor. Eventually,
Right.
by the way, because whiteness is malleable, Italians become white. It's a wild thing.
It
And
is.
while this is happening, we keep having these conspiracy theories that protect the powerful and make sure that if any election, and for people who don't follow this stuff, go and look at the Wilmington coup in the 19th century after the Civil War. I was just saying this the other night. The Civil War itself is an election denying conspiracy. The Ku Klux Klan is an election denying movement. It is all about saying things either go our way or there's a conspiracy against us and we have to destroy it with violence, which of course brings us to January 6th. I mean, it's
Right.
the same cycles over and over.
Yeah, when people say that, when you would hear people in the news, and I know they're saying this kind of loosely, but still, it kind of irritates me when to hear that, January 6th insurrection was unprecedented. I lived in New Orleans for 3 years. I'm like, the Battle of Liberty Place. There was literally a monument in downtown New Orleans that was, memorializing a white supremacist coup against the government of the local government that was seen as being too favorable to the blacks. So what did they do? They literally did overthrow that government. And if I'm not mistaken with my history, it took federal troops to obviously come back, but that you don't shake that type of thing off from your society.
Well, and I mean, the failure of Reconstruction is the
Yeah.
exact same thing. I personally think probably the most important pivot point in American history is Reconstruction. And you watch and you want to talk about like the Haitians after their revolution. You look at the South, it is a revolution through democracy, right?
Yeah.
The free peoples are just creating their own democratic movement that is just completely revolutionizing the South. And it takes, of course, the betrayal of both political parties, all of the major benefactors who are never on the side of democracy. They completely throw a wrench in all the works. You have domestic terrorists who go in there and make sure to clear house and make sure that all these things are undermined. You go to something like, again, Wilmington. They were avowedly white supremacists. Before they overthrew the government of Wilmington, they read the rights of white supremacy. I mean, it's not unprecedented, which is frankly what pisses me off. It's that when we look at modern American history and we pretend like, I'm not going to name names, it might be the president of the United States of America, who says this isn't who we are. It's who we have always been. There's not a fever that needs to pass. There is an existential crisis of the human soul that we're dealing with. It's not something to get past. There's no normal to return to. This is who we are. It's who we've always been, and who we'll be until we actually take a long look in the mirror and work on it.
I do love me some Barack Obama, and I understand what he was trying to do whenever he would say that, but I would shake my head to the point of pinching a nerve whenever he would say that's not who we are, because who else have we been? I mean, essentially, who else have?
Well, and real fast on the Barack Obama point, I think this is an important thing, and I know we're getting ready to do questions and stuff,
Sure.
but I think the Obama years are really, really important because Barack Obama believed in our institutions. I mean, even to this day, like all of his talks are about how deep down after all this, he believes in the institutions. He after 2008's financial collapse, he defended the markets. He defended, the status quo there. He said, let's not throw everything out. They still painted him as a Marxist, a socialist, a Muslim, Antichrist. And what happens there? And this is important in all of this. it launders how people felt about him. Suddenly, it's not racism or prejudice or xenophobia that is keeping you from appreciating somebody. You have to create a character, an evil conspiracy to stand up against. And those stories, I mean, I think there's no way to understand January 6th, 2021 without understanding America 2010 and the Tea Party and what happened with that and the money behind it and the people behind it. And again, if you just pretend like everything's fine, it just goes and it just increases.
Before we get into Q&A, I want to ask kind of a general question in terms of takeaways. So when everyone goes and gets your book and reads it and enjoys it as much as I did, what do you really want people to take away? Why is it important to recognize that apocalyptic Christianity and white supremacy and conspiracy theories have been weaponized in pursuit of authoritarianism? And maybe even broader, like what can we as individuals and as a society, what can we do to resist these trends?
Well, I'll go ahead and I'll say this. I think our ability to have this conversation, right? Our ability to be in this space and have this conversation, it revolves around personal trust, right? I have to get on here with the faith that you and I are going to meet each other on good terms, right? That I didn't come with an agenda to go after you. You didn't come here with an agenda to go after me. That allows, and I'm sorry to put it this way, it allows intimacy. It allows us to be honest and talk back and forth. The problem is that paranoid mindset, and I would go ahead and say patriarchal powers and energies, capitalistic powers and energies, but also white supremacy, it is about creating divisions. It's about creating a paranoid world where I can't trust anybody. And we've seen, by the way, the consequences. We've seen the atomization of our culture. Like we've seen people who don't know one another. They don't trust one another. Every election they think has been stolen, right? And everybody's trying to get one over on them. What I wanted to do with this is I wanted to expose those dangerous weaponized components of that paranoid mindset that has been used. Because I think what we're looking at right now is we are looking at a crisis in faith in our institutions and one another and in the status quo, whatever you want to call it. I think it's going to take a sea change. It's going to take us realizing that we are not just individuals. We are connected. We are interdependent. And whenever we see the world move forward, whenever we see democracy move forward, human dignity move forward, freedom move forward, we see people disabusing themselves of those lies, right? That they're individuals and everyone's out to get them. And they start to recognize, oh my God, we can do something together. And these other people who are trying to divide us, they're doing it for their benefit. And I think that's, personally, I'm optimistic. I don't think it's going to be easy. I do not think that it's going to just happen while we watch it on TV. I think we're going to have to do it ourselves. I think it's going to have to be a democratic movement that looks a lot like people's movements of the past. But what I hope to do is to begin at least creating some sort of an alternative narrative of what has happened that doesn't create divisions, inherently.
And I know this might play into somewhat the apocalypticism, but it could also play in a positive way. Do you think it will take some sort of crisis, like say the climate crisis, for us to realize and find a way where we all come together and realize that we're connected and start to build trust, because essentially we are going to have to work together in order to solve a crisis of this nature? Do you think it'll take a crisis to get there?
I think we're already seeing elements of that. I was talking to Omar before we started recording, and I think something like the pandemic, the pandemic itself just inherently is about interdependence. What I do and what you do in these systems, they affect one another. And like when it's so off kilter, it gets so bad. Obviously, some people retreated into weaponized individualism and paranoia and all of that. But I also think that what history shows us and what I talk about in this book is that there are these moments of crisis that can go either way. One of the things that I'm most concerned with is that the far right, and I'm talking about white supremacists, neo-feudalists, neo-Confederates, whatever we want to call them, they are basically one of the only voice in the halls of power that has an alternative. And it's to return to feudalism and white supremacist, structures where, Judeo-Christian values supposedly keep things intact. We have to create an alternative before they're the ones making the choices, right? Because like you just brought up climate change. I want to say something and I want to remind people, and it's not pleasant, but I want to talk about the stakes. The way that people were treated on our southern border without a climate crisis, right? With just political crises, that is a glimpse of what is possible, right? People don't like talked about this. I lived in Georgia for 10 years. You had refugees being forcibly sterilized. I mean, we're talking eugenics here.
Yeah, we're
That's
talking 1930s type stuff.
1930s type stuff. That's how bad it was. Now I want you to imagine, everybody, that our resources are shrinking. We're talking about literally shrinking with water rising. We're talking about resources going away. We have to defeat this authoritarian energy. We have to come together in order not just to stop climate change, but to go ahead and avoid the consequences of it. Because all of the stuff that we're dealing with right now, that's going to throw gas on it. And we got to be very careful about that.
Absolutely. So I do want to ask Omar at this time. I know we're at 46 after. Do we want to engage in Q&A?
Yeah, let's go for it.
All right. Do you want me to just read off these questions and kind of get them out there? Is that the best way to do this?
Sure. I mean, I can do it. Give you a
Okay.
little break.
Yeah, I will defer to you.
Okay. So I kind of laughed a little bit at this one because I hadn't heard it. In his recent press conference, the lovely Ron DeSantis rationalized banning the African American history course by saying there was a secret agenda of queer theory in the curriculum. He said something to the effect of, "This isn't even just CRT anymore, folks. Now it's queer theory." What are your thoughts on him rhetorically ratcheting up the danger and fear tactics, and what this says about where we may be going as a country?
If I could just make a remark before I turn it over to Jared for a more extensive comment, but the first thing I thought when I heard say it isn't enough to erase LGBTQ communities from white American history. Now we have to erase them from Black history and other communities of color, our histories. It was just an absolutely shockingly ignorant remark, screaming in Bayard Rustin. But yeah, Jared, I'll turn that question over to you. What are your thoughts about that?
There's a lot to say about this, so I'm going to try and say it fast. Okay,
Yeah.
So first things first, I think Ron DeSantis is an incredibly dangerous individual. He is a more competent and more professional Trump. One of the main
Agree.
problems that white America had with Trump was that he was embarrassing. It wasn't what he did. It wasn't what he stood for. And by the way, what I am seeing is that white middle-class America is already talking itself into voting for Ron DeSantis, which is terrifying. The next thing that I'll say is that he said a quote at that press conference where he says, "Who says that queer theory is an important part of African-American culture?" That right there, through a lens of whiteness, is incredible because it actually goes ahead and strips away the agency of two groups of people. And and Republicans do this all the time. It's the authoritarian point of view. We're the ones who decide what's important. They don't really matter. They get a seat at the table if they play ball. The final part of this, and Christoph, you're still in academia. I left academia after 16 years. I was in Georgia, and one of the things that I felt, and people need to be aware of this, it's not just the bills. It's not just the taking of books out of classrooms. It's not just going after certain courses. It is the message. And by the way, authoritarian cultures have done this for centuries. You go ahead, you play hardball with a few people, and you let everybody else know your job is on the line, and what you have is soft power. Suddenly people are afraid to teach certain things. They're afraid to teach certain books. There's an intimidation. And I have seen people who have either crumbled underneath it. I've seen people whose lives have fallen apart from the anxiety and the stress. I mean, what is happening right now in the academy, and particularly the attacks on it, really can't be understated how dangerous it is and how the precursors to that are throughout history.
I agree. I mean, I'm very fortunate to be able to be at the University of Maryland, which is a state that's backed up by a fairly progressive legislature. And obviously we have Governor Moore in office now. I have colleagues who I shall not name, but they obviously teach in states that have very conservative legislatures and or very conservative governors who are increasingly trying to affect their livelihood for simply teaching what they believe to be true, with some rigor. And so it's a very frightening time in which we live in.
And I just want to add one more thing because this is important for this conversation. I don't know how else to say this. It is very easy to espouse principles. very, very easy to say that you believe, in this house, we believe in love, and in this
Right.
house, all of this.
Yeah.
That doesn't cost you anything. In fact, there is an economic incentive in it, right? To be seen as open-minded and being anti-Trump or whatever. The
Right.
problem that we see, and this is something, I don't say this lightly, what I didn't know before I wrote this book was, if you look at 1930s, 1940s Germany and Italy, it's a lot of people who went along with things that they never thought that they would have gone along with. And there are pressures. Your job is on the line. The economy might even be weirded out, right? Like, which is part of this. If the economy
Sure.
goes south, the Republicans are going to fix it, which they
Right.
never do. But there are people right now who even are sitting around saying, I would never be okay with this. And the tensions they create, like, allow people to talk themselves into it. I know people in the academy who are just like, well, I'm just not going to teach that stuff. And it's saving themselves.
Yeah.
And that's part of the issue is we do have to stand up to this stuff. It does take courage, because the easiest thing in the world to do is to go along with it, unfortunately.
Absolutely. We have to understand how power works, and we have to respond accordingly. And yes, there will unfortunately be risk, but that's how we make change.
That's right.
Someone just asked a question. Do reactionary movements always remain in latency secrecy after defeat, or are there historical examples of their complete dissolution and or assimilation?
I have a really bad answer on this front. There's no real such thing as defeating it. This is a side effect of the human condition. I will go ahead and I'll say that I think one of the major problems that we have in modern history, and we don't like talking about it, fascism and Nazism were defeated militarily. You cannot suppress an ideology. And on top of that, the Allies, particularly the United States and Great Britain, who defeated fascism and Nazism, saw it immediately as being incredibly useful in fighting off communism. And so what happened before World War II had even ended was that Nazis and fascists were drafted into the service of fighting socialism and communism. The entire point is this, and this is something I figured out writing the book, which is authoritarianism of any and all stripes is incredibly useful for white supremacist capitalism. And so they're not defeated. They're not stamped out. They're repurposed. One of the things that we don't like talking about in American history is how useful dictators have been, and particularly how useful authoritarian regimes that exploit people, particularly vulnerable people and vulnerable civilizations, like how useful that is. So unfortunately, they're not destroyed. They can be defeated militarily. They can be defeated democratically. In fact, they can be suppressed. But even in good times where we're not talking about white supremacist authoritarian movements like we are now, they're still there. And one of the issues, by the way, is we took our boot off the neck of white supremacy. The 1990s were a huge time for white supremacists in the United States of America. Go back, of course, to the Oklahoma City bombing. That should have been the moment where law enforcement took them down. But unfortunately, law enforcement in this country and around the world walk hand in hand with white supremacy. So the issue is that you always have to keep an eye on it.
And speaking of things going on in Europe, where do you feel that the war in Ukraine fits into the global struggle between democracy and authoritarianism? What may this conflict symbolize in the coming crisis you discuss in your book?
Christoph, do you want to start on this, and I'll tag along?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I discussing with a friend who's Black about the war in Ukraine a while back, and I won't divulge identities because I want to keep that secret, but just kind of to give you a general sense of how I think about the war in Ukraine and how it relates. There is sort of a strain of thought, and I don't think actually it's unique to the Black community in America. I think it's you can find it in other communities where it's like, we've got more important things to worry about. Why are we spending this much money in Ukraine? Man, they could take all this money, they could solve the problems of Black America or rural America or urban America or what have you. Why are we spending this much time when our communities are being neglected? And that got us into a conversation about Putinism, got us into a conversation about authoritarianism. And the question I posed to my friend was, do you think Black Americans will be safer if this strain of authoritarianism is empowered around the globe, is empowered in Ukraine? Do you think, I mean, knowing what you know about Russia's proliferation of misinformation, especially racist disinformation in the United States, do you think that will empower them to do even more of that? Or do you think that they'll say, okay, we've got Ukraine, we're good? So it really is a challenge, but it's really important to get people to understand the local and domestic connections of things that are going on in Ukraine and elsewhere as it relates to the rise of authoritarianism and the threat of it.
So to go ahead and obviously this is a hugely complicated thing. It's a lot harder to talk about than it is in a 5-minute cable news spot, right? Part of what's happening here, and I want to make this very clear, Putinism is exactly like what we're seeing in the United States of America with right-wing white supremacist reactionary movements. Also, same thing that we're seeing in Hungary. There is an international connected right-wing white supremacist paranoid authoritarian movement. This is part and parcel of it. It's the same conspiracy theories, it's the same appeals, it's the same ideas. It just so happens that the reason this happened is the same type of reason why World War I happened, which is that there is a global order that is set in stone, and you if you're at the bottom of the order, which Russia has been near the bottom of that order, you have every incentive to go ahead and shake things up. They believe that this is the moment where the world order, going back to the fact this is called the Midnight Kingdom, they believe that it is ripe for things to change, which is why Dugin and Putin wanted to do this in the first place. But as this is happening, and going back to what you said, nobody is addressing the major issue, which is, why is Vladimir Putin the dictator of Russia? Why is this thing possible? And it's because he has been an absolutely incredibly useful cog within the world system. His blood money and the dictatorial blood money that comes out of Russia, it's part of what makes this entire thing go. It corrupts everything. I wasn't shocked, I'm sure you weren't either, Christoph, when we saw that the FBI head of counterintelligence was on the take from an oligarch. Of course not. These systems are corruptive, and you can't deal with this. You can't sit there and say, oh, he's on our blacklist, when all of a sudden it's like, he was a G8 2 years ago, and he'll be a G8 2 years from now if he survives this. The problem is that this system that we're talking about is corruptive and authoritarian in nature. It just so happens about what type of a sheen you can have on it, right? And so we need to talk about reform, and we need to talk about democracy. And you're absolutely right. This war, he cannot win. He cannot win because it will help spread this authoritarianism. But that also doesn't mean that there's one side that is absolutely good and they don't have any blood on their hands. They have helped create this scenario in the first place.
I mean, we saw that echoes in Brazil with the attack of the Brazilian Congress and the presidential palace. I mean, that was just straight up rip a page off from the January 6th insurrectionists.
And probably, and I'm so glad you brought that up, because this is important to mention, probably funded by the exact same people who funded January 6th and who also funded the Ottawa truckers convoy protest in Canada. It is and by the way, Putin is part of this, and the Republican Party takes orders from these people as well. It is the same people who have been spending their billions of dollars, the DeVosses, the Bradleys, the Kochs, you name them, going down the list. These people have been going after democracy. They've been going after nascent movements of people of color, the poor, women, trans, gay people, you name them. Those people are happening behind the scenes. We don't talk about them. We never, ever mention them. And also that's because things like the Democratic Party also take donations from the same people. And these markets operate on the same people. But you're exactly right. It's the same problem all the way through and through.
Great. I'm trying not to get caught up in the conversation. I'm gonna try and combine two questions at the same time. Let me see if I can do this.
I have one question I want to answer, but I'm hoping this gets in there.
Yeah. So someone's asking about encouraging people to get out of their bubbles. And there's another question about long-term positive change. And I wonder, like, here's my setup for this, because I grew up in Connecticut. My family's from Puerto Rico, but I grew up in Connecticut. So very well aware of empire and segregation and things like that. But having grown up in New England, everyone outside of New England is evil. Everyone in a red state is evil. Everyone in the South is evil. We're the good ones. We're the good guys. We're the progressive ones. And I have never lived anywhere else but New England, but I constantly fight back on this because of my lived experience of living in a very segregated Connecticut, which thankfully is less segregated now than it was in the 90s, but still has its issues. So I guess what I want to put these two questions together is, um, how do we move away from this wanting to be in these bubbles and making and creating that other evil, that whatever sides we're on, the other side is the bad side, rather than finding
Yeah.
finding some time, finding some patience, some humanity
Yeah.
to not be yelling at each other and screaming. And I don't want it to sound
Yeah.
naive either, but I think you know where I'm trying to go with this.
Well, whenever I answer a question like this, I like to answer it first of all from a purely self-interested standpoint. You make less money because you have been divided from other people. Like white supremacy is like incredible in terms of making sure that your wages are lower, right?
It's a tax.
Oh my God. Like you have so much money to earn. You have so much more life to live. Like you're being poisoned. You've been talked into like turning like gas stoves on and like poisoning your children just in order to somehow or another score points for the bosses. I don't know what to tell you.
Like,
So first of all, I got to tell you also, and this is coming from somebody who has a background in red states. I know everybody says, oh, look at the red states. They have what's coming to them. That's not going to stay there. And by the way, there are good people in those states who are being oppressed. But I have to tell you, if you start ransoming off like vulnerable communities, history has a lesson for you. Unless you are in the 1%, they're coming for you as well at some point. Like this is a false bill of goods. So self-interested, there's that.
yeah.
Number two, I got to tell you that this balkanization that we're talking about, red states versus blue states, it's already dealing out some L's. We always thought that when Roe v. Wade went down, that there was going to be riots in the streets. Instead, what did we see? Oh, the blue states are like, thank God it didn't happen to us. The red states felt like they didn't have anything to do. That is going to increase, and your world is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. There is nothing that any of these appeals or any of these things, they'll get you, is what I'll say. And very, very quickly, I think we have to have conversations about power. I don't talk about red versus blue. I don't talk Democrat versus Republican. I don't talk Biden versus Trump. I talk about what actual power does. And I have to tell you, even when I talk to the most diehard Trumpist, if they understand that I'm not coming in to like, promote Biden or Clinton or whoever, they will even tell me that they think that Donald Trump is full of it and that they know that he's not some sort of a messiah. If you talk about power, actual ways that power works, people will listen and they'll have conversations.
So,
Can I finish on one question?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I would love to hear what Christoph has to say about it too. And I'll read it, and Christoph, you can take it, and then I'll say my thing. This is from Noel. Oh no, it jumped away. I got it. Nope, it went away. Oh no, it's Lynn. I got it. To Jared and Christoph, here we go. Does this history and information motivate you to want more inclusion of a variety of world and native religions?
I mean, just thinking to the answer, how I might answer the previous question. I mean, and again, it's easier said than done, depending on where you are in parts of the country. But there is absolutely, in my opinion, no downside and all the upside in the world to exposing people to as many different kinds of people as possible from the youngest possible age. I think that's how you counteract a lot of the distrust issues, because I grew up in a community, an environment, for instance, where super evangelical, super conservatively evangelical, fire and brimstone, homosexuality is horrible. It's the worst thing. Don't ever let it happen to you. Don't associate, But what do? You go out in the world, you go to college, you meet gay people. They don't bite you. They're just normal people. And you mix with a lot of different kinds of people, Jewish people, atheist people who don't believe in anything. I think that's the best way that you can build trust that can overcome some of the things that we're talking about, is when you meet people on very simple terms, get to know it's very difficult. For some people it isn't, but for the most part, it's very difficult to hate somebody that you get to know on a very intimate level and observe how they live their life and realize that they just put on their pants and live their lives and eat and do all the things that you do as well. So it's at the risk of sounding Pollyannish, but I do think there's something to it. I think that there's a lot of benefit. And that's why, of course, these authoritarian type rulers hate that, right? Because they know the effect that has.
Yep.
You know, there's a lot of forms of Christianity and other religions, but especially Christianity, that says, you know, don't associate with non-believers. Those are bad people. You know, they're probably going to eat you while you're sleeping, whatever they want to say. So people with power understand how powerful that is, which is precisely why we ought to do it.
I mean, there's a reason why the state of Florida wants to erase the public existence of gay and trans people,
Yeah.
because your teacher might be gay and you might realize that they're normal people, right?
Yeah.
The entire point is to cut off that knowledge. This is why they hate multiculturalism, because it actually does create the opportunity for us to compare notes and have discussions and get to know one another. I mean, there's a reason why in recent years they've gone away from being like overtly anti-gay to only being after the groomer gay people, right? Which is because there are more people who have, you know, gay people in their family, more gay people in their community, all of that. That now they want to go ahead and reverse time and basically put us back into these bubbles that you were talking about, Omar. And then on top of that, like, I would go ahead and say that one of the things that you can tell from world history, particularly the era of colonialism, is that the cultures that are destroyed are specifically cultures that are very, very tolerant and inclusive. They are the cultures that aren't interested in destroying the environment. They're not interested in oppressing women. They're not interested in like carrying out genocides. What has happened is that the modern world was created by the most violent and the most oppressive. And if you actually look back at the religions that have been crushed by Christianity through state power, you go back and you look at the civilizations that have been wiped out through genocide and slavery and war. Those are those are the civilizations and the people that we can learn from.
Right.
They had societies that worked, that were sustainable, and that people had better lives. You look at some of these native populations that got wiped out, they lived better lives than what we live now. And I think we have everything to learn from them and understand that this is not the best of all worlds.
Yeah, totally agree. Totally agree.
So we will end it there. I mean, we could go on for hours. We're just missing the whiskey, right, Jared?
Deal me in.
See, we can do an alternative version of this where we got the bottle. That'd be nice.
I'll do a cable television version, yeah.
If you want to buy Jared's book, you can do so through our museum store. I put a couple of links in the chat, but you could also go to our website, marktwainhouse.org. And you can also join us for some future free virtual programs. We are gonna have a really awesome one coming up on Tuesday, also at 7 p.m. called State on Freedom, where Dr. Dan Berger will explore the Black Power movement. And he's gonna have a couple of guests, which include the people that the book is about. So please join us for that as well. Thank you so much, Christoph and Jared. This has been amazing. And I hope we can bring you back in some way or another very soon.
My absolute pleasure.
I thank you so much, Omar, for putting this together. This has been a real treat for me. And Christoph, I just adore you, and this meant so much to me and all the people watching and listening. It's so cool that you spent your Thursday night with us, and just really, really appreciate you. Take care.
Yes, absolutely appreciate you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great night, everyone.
Be safe.